couple of days ago, I read this endearing, almost cute comment about a player having antsy feet and being worried about getting into LFR first time and making a mistake, and the fear of possibly being kicked from the group. The memories of the first time getting into a raid. Well, to be fair, there wasn't LFR when I started, but it led me to a good point to have for today, which is the things I wish I knew when starting. This time around, though, we're going over Mythic Plus, because also being the newer of the activities, many players might be finding themselves more in this point rather than the raid, which has been a staple in this game for 2 decades, basically, unlike Mythic Plus. And a few of the things I wish I knew that would have allowed me to understand a little bit more how Mythic Plus goes. Whether it is from the actual in-game part, like the UI, the weak auras, the add-ons, or things about the meta, things about how the community plays around Mythic Plus, the choices of the specs, how the players behave inside of the dungeons compared to other activities, as well as things you're expected to know, things you're expected to do in Mythic Plus that are quite different from other activities or other things you're used to, for example, compared to the raid. And the number one, definitely the number one thing that changes the most compared to the other major activity being the raid, is definitely knowing your way around the meta. Now, obviously, this is not as relevant if you are a budding Mythic Plus player just dipping your feet into the content. This is irrelevant. You can go ahead and play your Mythic Plus keys as an Affliction Warlock, as a Marksmanship Hunter, as a Protection Warrior. There is no problem. +5 keys, +10 keys, +15 keys even. No issue whatsoever. What, however, I wish I knew when starting Mythic Plus was to have a clear goal in mind, something to reach, an achievement to reach, so that I could better plan my choices. Because one thing is to say, I only care about portals, that's my achievement, that's my milestone, so I want to get to +20 to get my portals. Well, in that case, as mentioned before, it won't matter too much the type of spec, for example, you choose to get to that goal. However, if your milestone gets a little bit higher, I don't want to get just the portals, I want to get to 3k rating, to 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, even more so I want to aim for title level Mythic Plus keys. The higher you go, the more relevant is going to be your choice of spec to play. As I said, it's quite different from the raid, because in the raid you have more freedom, you have more options, obviously, since you have 20 people in a Mythic raid, for example, you have way more room for multiple specs to make it in compared to Mythic Plus. In Mythic Plus, it's just one tank, it's just one healer. So the possibility of one of these picks becoming very oppressive and dominating the meta and kicking out all of the other options is much larger compared to the raid. So it is something that could be quite smart of you to be aware of when you start Mythic Plus, knowing your goal and knowing how much the meta could impact reaching that goal. If you think I am going to get to 3.4k rating as my goal on a Protection Warrior, you need to be aware that to get to that level as a Protection Warrior is going to be quite hard, because less than 1% of the tanks at that rating are going to be Protection Warriors. So obviously you will find problems when trying to get to that goal with that spec. That's what could help new starting players having an idea that the meta will definitely impact their room to play, their chances to get to play in Mythic Plus keys the higher you go and the more competitive you are. The other thing I wish I knew, just so that I could be ready for what was to come, was the responsibility. Because much like anything, almost anything related to the raid, Mythic Plus is shrunk. Mythic Plus is shrunk by 4 times as much. You go from 20 players in Mythic raiding to 5 players. So Before, in the raid, you could chill. You could chill by the sideline. You could be the type of player that the raid leader never asks to do any mechanics because he doesn't trust you. He's like, okay, I'm gonna call my couple of buddies, this officer and this other veteran core raider, which I trust, and put them in the interrupt rotation for this very dangerous ad in the raid. And you could just coast by the encounter without having to do any particularly dangerous, wipeable mechanics. You know, the seeds? You have never done a seed in your life on Farak. Of course, nobody trusts you to do seeds on Farak. Well, there is a problem. There is a problem because in Mythic Plus that is not going to be possible. In Mythic Plus, everyone will be expected to contribute with whatever toolkit they might have as a spec to make the key faster and smoother. So, we are talking about interrupts, we're talking about stuns, slows, roots, disorients, mind controls, knockbacks, knockups, anything of the sort that might help whichever, affix or whichever mechanic you are dealing with in that dungeon. So while, for example, if you were raiding or if you were casually doing heroic dungeons, mythic 0 dungeons, time walking, LFR, you might have gotten away with not being nearly as knowledgeable in your spec. This is not gonna fly nearly as well in Mythic Plus. Again, the higher you go and the more competitive you become, right? As a druid, you will eventually be required to make good use of things like incapacitating roar to disorient enemies, very good for interrupting casts that cannot be interrupted, so you disorient them instead. You can use Vortex to trap enemies inside, learning, for example, that the dogs in Throne of the Tides doing the fixate, you can just drop Vortex on top of them and they won't move. You can do the same to things like spiteful mobs, for example. You can learn how to use Typhoon to knock players out of sanguine pools, for example. On certain bosses, you might learn to use, for example, entangling roots or mass entanglement to stop mobs from moving. That could be quite useful on certain bosses. All of these things become, of course, way more valuable in Mythic Plus and will require you to be way more knowledgeable about your spec. Besides your 1, 2, 3 DPS rotation, which might even be okay in the raid, you might even fly under the radar as an okay passable raider. That's not gonna fly nearly as well in Mythic Plus. Things will start overwhelming your group if not everyone is interrupting, not everyone is stopping those dangerous casts. Eventually things will turn into a clusterfuck. The experience for everyone will get worse, and you will feel that. You will feel that more in a Mythic Plus key compared to a raid, for example. So that's the other thing that's worth realizing as you start Mythic Plus, that there is not nearly as much room for dead weight. There is not really as much room for averagely mediocre players to be carried as there is in the raid. That is the other point that could help players get onto the same page when it comes to getting into Mythic Plus for the first times. The next point is a point we have pointed out before multiple times, which is the add-ons, the weak auras, the stuff, the extra game stuff that you can use to help yourself in Mythic Plus keys. This is kind of a boomer point. There are some players that are adamant they don't need add-ons, that the add-ons are simplifying the game too much, or any other kind of arguments like these. Well, the point is that to face reality when it comes to the raid, and nowadays Mythic Plus as well, things have gotten complicated enough that you kind of require these things to help you in a Mythic Plus environment. Whether it is to have a list of interrupts available to your party so you know who can interrupt which mob, whether it is to have a weak aura that shows you which enemy is targeting which player with which cast. It could help the healer to know who to put an external on, who to heal to max before they get hit by the ability. It could help the DPS players to know if they have to use their own defensive as they are about to be hit by the mechanic. You can use other things like an order of priority for crowd controls, so you know when is your turn to use your AoE CC on this group of mobs. Weak auras that put the cooldown of the abilities of the trash mobs next to their nameplate, so you know when their dangerous stuff is about to come back and available. All of these things are just going to make your life easier in Mythic Plus. And obviously, much like we said with the first point with the meta, Mythic Plus, its entire existence is about scaling in difficulty and competitiveness over time. So anything we are saying here becomes more and more relevant the higher you go. No, of course, you don't need a list of interrupts or nameplate weak auras to check when the mobs are using their abilities if you're doing a +10, or a +12, or a +16, or even a +18. None of this will be necessary from the get-go. But, as I said, depending on your goals, the higher you go, the more these things will become quite helpful for you to better perform in Mythic Plus. So it's also good practice to just start having these things from the get-go. If your plans are already, if your goals are already to push at a certain level in Mythic Plus, you might as well get off on a good start and start getting used to these things already. You know, when I was doing +27 keys on my priest and using all of these things, it's not that when I dropped down to my druid and started doing +10s, I disabled all of them, and I only started enabling them again when I started doing +22 keys on the druid. No, I kept them on and running since the start, since the beginning, to get used to them on another spec as well, because that will be helpful for me to get used to acclimatize to the environment on a different spec in Mythic Plus. The other part that is good to get used to when it comes to Mythic Plus, which is quite the change of pace compared to the raid, is solitude. Is being alone, being left to fend for yourself. This is particularly relevant for players who are or have been habitual raiders in, for example, a guild, and then jump into Mythic Plus. In the raid, you are used to having other players, other guild members next to you, helping you around, doing all the things together for the success of the raid, and then you jump into Mythic Plus with complete strangers. Nobody cares about you. They are there to get rating or to get loot. They don't particularly care about your well-being or your success. This is something you have to translate quite quickly into a lifestyle when you get into Mythic Plus, until perhaps you reach a certain point where you can start running Mythic Plus keys with your own group. Until you get to that point, many of the things happening in Mythic Plus, you always have to think, you always have to come with the mindset that everyone else outside of you in the dungeon is a terrible player, who is actively attempting to grief and sabotage your key and mess up every possible thing that can be messed up. And you are essentially the sole beacon of success of that group. Without you, they are screwed. That is a necessary mindset you will need to have in Mythic Plus when essentially everyone around you is a stranger. You don't know what they will be doing, you don't know how they will be playing, you don't know if they are even bothering to use a flask, to use DPS potion, you have no idea as a healer if they actually will be using their defensives when they are supposed to, if they are a mage who even bothered to spec into D-Curse during Afflicted Week. You don't know. You're up to the whims of these players in a Mythic Plus key, as opposed to an organized guild raid group in a raid encounter. It can be quite a jump in attitude, going from players you know how they play, you have known for a while, from a raid group, to the environment of a Mythic Plus key with complete strangers. So it's good to already know ahead of time that this is going to happen in Mythic Plus, that sometimes some frustrating things can happen in Mythic Plus, players randomly leaving, players starting to blaming each other. Maybe you're even confused because they were the ones who messed up, they were the ones who did the mistake, and then they started flaming someone else, they started blaming the fault of the mistakes on someone else. That will happen. You might not be used to it in a raid, especially if you're not pugging, but you're doing raids with a consistent group. That will not happen very often, but in Mythic Plus, you have to get ready for that happening quite often. And also, as a surprise, unlike what we just said about Mythic Plus, about all of these things becoming more and more relevant the higher the level of the key, the higher the difficulty level of the key, funnily enough, these type of behaviors tend to actually happen more earlier on. You are much more likely to see this type of flaming and this type of blame game happening in a +18 key or a +21 key than you are seeing this in a +27 key, for example. So you are actually even more likely to see these type of behaviors as you start your progress, your experience inside of Mythic Plus keys. So just be prepared for that, because it will happen. And just have a thick enough skin to know that you are the good ones, they were the bad ones, they were the ones who made a mistake, and it's not your fault. Unless it's your fault, of course. In that case, then I hope you're not the one starting to blame other players for your own mistakes. And own up to your own faults and perhaps improve by the time you get into the next dungeon. The last point, which is perhaps something that might come as an obvious thing, but it's actually very important to have the right mindset when approaching this, which is that everyone will make mistakes. For a long time inside of Mythic Plus, the amount of knowledge you're gonna have to soak up when getting used to Mythic Plus is massive. Not only do you have to start learning all of the damage patterns of the boss, plus the damage patterns of the trash mobs, which will actually keep changing as you grow in key level, because initially you will totally be able to ignore this Oracle caster in Throne of the Tides because the hit does 50k damage and nobody cares. But then you will find yourself in a plus 26 fortified key, and if that same Frostbolt cast goes off, your DPS will get hit for 650,000 damage, and that becomes a little bit more problematic. So you have to gather a large amount of knowledge from the enemies, from the trash mob enemies, the boss enemies, the route for all of the pools, when you want to use your cooldowns, when it's better to save your big cooldowns or use them in particular pools, when you should use your defensives or not. Then you also have to be aware of what the other specs can do, because if you're a healer, you want to know the type of defensives of the rest of your party. If you're a tank, you also want to know the type of offensive cooldowns of your DPS, depending on the pool you are going for. Then you have room to mess up when trying to deal with things like incorporeal, like afflicted, like getting smacked by spiteful. There is a series of things you can make mistakes on. You can even lose your mouse cursor, panic, and forget to interrupt a mob, and the mob is gonna kill someone, and the pool is gonna go into flames, people will start blaming each other, and the key will break. And that will be all your fault. That will just happen. Multiple times, in fact. And you will have to get used to, to dealing with the mistakes and then hopefully improving, learning what you just messed up and what you can do better the next time. This is one of the things that is even more diverse than raiding. In raiding, a single player has way fewer chances to just mess everything up. Even in this tier, with quite a few bosses having some raid-wide one-shot mechanics if you mess them up, in Mythic Plus you have even more room for all of these mistakes. So you will be the fault, you will be the reason why you wipe multiple times, and that's okay. That's okay. As long as you just learn from it and keep improving, that's the way to go whenever you enter Mythic Plus. Just don't think because you had tunnel vision and you backpedaled into another pack of mobs that you ninja pull and you wipe the entire group and the group disbands that you are now banned forever from Mythic Plus. That just happens, the body pull is a tried and true mark of the real Mythic Plus player. Everyone will have to do it at least once or at least a dozen times before they get better. So that's a perfectly okay thing to go through. And that should not demoralize you from wanting to continue to go into Mythic Plus and keep improving. Because one of the hallmarks, one of the trademarks of improving is of course to stop making those mistakes. So keep doing those mistakes so you can then slowly and gradually improve and do fewer and fewer of them over time. That's the feel-good, optimistic take we have left for last when it comes to things I wish I knew when getting into Mythic Plus, knowing these things ahead of time, being prepared with all of these things ahead of time as I started getting into the grind of Mythic Plus. I think many of these things could help many players have a better experience when getting into Mythic Plus and starting to get used to the Mythic Plus activity as a whole nowadays. With all of these tips hopefully helping some of you, we are now leaving each other on this Sunday, I believe. Yeah, Sunday. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below to help with the DViews YouTube algorithm, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, sadly, by the time I stopped making this video, it has also stopped raining. It's my feel-good weather in the winter when you're stuck inside. Unlucky.